No decent man marries a woman who smells of the stable. Lavinia Ashby said it to Mrs. Pruitt on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry through the open double doors of the livery across the street, where Hattie Sutter stood, with a horseshoe still glowing at the edges in her tongs. She did not look up. She did not set down the shoe. She finished driving the nail, straightened her back, and went on working, as if the words had simply blown past her, like dust off the road. But 3 people in that town heard those words that morning, and one of them would spend the rest of his life making certain they were never true again. If you've ever been the one nobody thought to invite, the one whose worth got measured by everything except the work of her hands, stay with me. Hit subscribe, drop the name of your town in the comments, and stay until the end, because what happens to Hattie Sutter by the last page of this story is worth every minute you give it. Now, let's go back to Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming territory, in the dry spring of 1884, to where it all began. Sutter's Livery and Feed sat at the low end of Main Street, where the boardwalk gave out to packed dirt and the smell of hay and horse sweat took over from coffee and dry goods. Hattie Sutter had run it alone for 2 winters, since her father Ezra had gone to his rest and left her nothing but the barn, 6 stalls, a forge, and a debt she did not yet know the size of. She was a broad, big-boned woman in her early 30s, with wide, capable shoulders and thick forearms, roped with the kind of strength that came only from years of hauling feed sacks and holding fractious horses, steady with nothing but her own weight and her own calm. Her apron, flour-dusted more from the grain bins than from any kitchen, rounded out over a belly that had carried the weight of every hard season the valley had thrown at her, and she wore that weight the way a good mare wears muscle, plainly without apology, because it was earned. Her hands were thick-fingered and sure. Her face, full and flushed from the forge heat, held a kind of patience that had outlasted every man who'd ever told her the livery was no place for a woman alone. Larkspur Hollow was not a large town. One long street of clapboard storefronts running between the church and the depot road, a scatter of ranches spreading out into the foothills beyond it, and a creek that had, in wetter years, been generous enough that no one thought much about who controlled it. Hattie had grown up in that town, knowing every one of its unspoken rules, including the one that mattered most to a woman built the way she was, that a full-figured woman who ran her own business was tolerated so long as she was useful, and mocked the moment anyone decided she had grown too comfortable in her usefulness. She rose before the sun most mornings to feed and water 11 stalls worth of horses before the street even woke, and by the time the Mercantile opened its doors, she had already mucked 3 stalls, mended a length of harness, and hauled 200 pounds of feed sacks from the wagon to the bin without once asking a soul for help she hadn't been offered. She had heard worse than what Lavinia Ashby said that morning. 3 weeks before, a cattle buyer named Purdy had come through looking to move a herd east, and when Hattie quoted him a fair price on shoeing his outfit's horses, he had laughed, not unkindly at first, and then unkindly on purpose, once he understood she meant to hold her price. "You'd do better finding a husband than running a barn, ma'am," he'd said, looking her up and down the way a man looks at livestock he has already decided not to buy. "Though I expect a woman who smells of horse and hay from dawn to dark doesn't get many offers." He'd laughed again, glancing at his drover for approval, and the drover had laughed too, because that was easier than not laughing. Hattie had not answered him. She had finished shoeing his led horse, taken his money to the exact penny of her quoted price, and watched him ride out without a single word wasted on a man who wasn't worth the breath. Her hands had not shaken. That night, alone in the loft room above the stalls, she had sat very still for a long time with her father's account book open on her knees, running one thick finger down a column of numbers that did not add up the way she needed them to, and she had not cried. She had simply closed the book, blown out the lamp, and gone to sleep so she could rise before dawn and do it all again. The town of Larkspur Hollow did not have many secrets, and the biggest of them concerned the man who owned the Circle K, the largest cattle spread in 3 counties. Everett Kincaid had been back east for the better part of 2 years, settling his late father's affairs and selling off land his father had bought poorly, and when he finally rode back into the valley that spring, he came home to find the creek running low, the grass thinner than it should have been for the season, and half the small outfits in the valley already nervous about the water. He was a tall, lean man, sun-browned and quiet, with the kind of stillness that made loud men feel foolish standing next to him. He did not announce himself, he simply appeared at the edge of things, at the mercantile, at church, at the livery, and watched, and listened, and said very little, because in his experience the men who talked the most usually had the least worth hearing. He had come home to a valley he barely recognized. 2 years of settling his father's debts and disputes in courthouses and law offices back east had aged him past his years, and he had ridden the last stretch into Larkspur Hollow, half expecting to find the Circle K sold out from under him by some cousin's paperwork, the way so much else of his father's estate had nearly gone. Instead, he'd found the ranch standing, the grass thin but holding, and a town that seemed, on the surface, exactly as he'd left it. The same faces at church, the same gossip on the boardwalk, the same rich widow holding court outside the mercantile. It took him only a handful of days to sense that something underneath the surface had shifted, quietly, the way water shifts before a dam gives way, though he could not yet have named what it was. He noticed Hattie Sutter on his second day back, not because anyone pointed her out to him, but because his father's old barn foreman had told him once, years before, that if a man wanted to know the true character of a town, he should watch how it treated the person nobody thought was watching. Everett Kincaid had never forgotten that. So on his second day back in Larkspur Hollow, when his prized stallion Ranger came up lame after the long ride from Cheyenne, he did not take the horse to Miller's Livery on the good end of Main Street, where the paint was fresh and the sign was gilded. He walked the horse the extra quarter-mile to Sutter's, because his father had always sworn that old Ezra Sutter kept the soundest forge and the honestest hands in the territory, and Everett had come home believing that some things were still worth trusting. Hattie looked up when the bell over the barn door rang, expecting a farmer or a drover, and found instead the richest man in the territory standing in her doorway with his hat in his hand and a limping black stallion behind him, looking at her the way a man looks at someone he has already decided to respect before he has any reason to. "Ma'am," he said, "my horse has come up lame in the off-fore. I'd be obliged if you'd look at him." She did not fuss over who he was. She knelt in the straw right there, ran her thick fingers down the stallion's leg, with a touch so gentle the big horse stood still as a stone, and found the stone bruise in under a minute. "He'll want a poultice and 3 days off that foot, not a shoe," she told him plainly. "Any farrier who tells you different is after your money, not your horse's soundness." Everett Kincaid looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has been searching for without knowing it. "That's the first honest answer I've had since I crossed back into this county," he said, and it was the longest sentence anyone had heard him speak since his return. He came back the next Friday to check on the poultice. The horse did not need checking. Hattie could see plainly the swelling had gone down, and the stallion was sound. But Everett Kincaid stood in the doorway of her barn that Friday morning, with his hat against his chest, and asked her opinion on the water levels in the creek that fed his west pasture, and she gave him an honest answer, because that was the only kind she knew how to give. He came back the Friday after that with a question about a young gelding he was thinking of buying for his foreman's boy, and stayed an hour past when the question had been answered, talking with her about bloodlines and confirmation and the particular stubbornness of Missouri mules, while she worked the forge, and he leaned against the stall door, and neither of them mentioned that his horse had not needed a single one of those visits. On the third Friday he brought no question at all, only a jar of his cook's peach preserves, set it on the workbench without comment, and stood watching Hattie true up a wagon wheel with a patience that made the hour pass like 10 minutes. She found herself, without quite deciding to, telling him things she had not said aloud to anyone since her father died. How she'd learned to read a horse's lameness by the sound of its stride before she ever learned her letters. How she'd sat up 3 nights running with a colicking mare the winter her father took sick. How she sometimes still reached for his opinion out of habit before remembering there was no one left in the loft room to give it. Everett did not offer sympathy she hadn't asked for. He simply listened, the way he listened to everything, as though her words carried the same weight as a doctor's diagnosis or a banker's figures, and that, more than any compliment a man had ever paid her, was what began to loosen something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 2 years. By the 4th Friday, the whole street had begun to notice that the richest man in the territory rode into town every week at the same hour and walked, every single time, straight past Miller's gilded sign to the low end of Main Street, where the paint was peeling and the woman who ran the place smelled, as certain people like to say, of horse and hay. By the 6th Friday, Everett Kincaid had started bringing a sack of oats from his own stores as an excuse, a trade, he called it, for her trouble, though everyone who watched him carry it in with his own 2 hands, rather than sending a ranch hand, understood it for what it was. Hattie understood it too, though she did not let herself believe it, not fully. Not yet. A woman built the way she was built had learned a long time ago not to trust the sound of her own hoping. "You don't have to keep bringing oats, Mr. Kincaid," she told him on that 6th Friday, not looking up from the harness she was mending. "Your horse is sound, has been sound for a month." "I know it," he said, and then, after a silence long enough that she finally did look up, he added, "I keep finding reasons to ride this way regardless. Figured you'd work that out by now, being as sharp as you are about everything else." She had worked it out. She simply hadn't known what to do with it, because in her experience, men who rode past Miller's gilded sign to reach her did not usually do it for reasons she was permitted to hope about. Lavinia Ashby had buried 2 husbands and outlived them both in wealth and influence, and she had spent the years since building the Ashby Land and Cattle Company into the quiet power behind half the paper in the valley. She was the kind of woman who wore mourning gray like armor and delivered cruelty in the exact cadence of concern, so that a listener walked away from her feeling insulted and could not, an hour later, say precisely how it had been done. She had come to Larkspur Hollow that spring with her niece Eugenia in tow, a pale, quiet girl of 20, fresh from finishing school in Denver, and she had made her intentions plain to anyone who mattered within a week of her arrival. Eugenia would marry Everett Kincaid before the year was out, and the Circle K's grazing land would be joined, by marriage and by paper, to the water rights Lavinia already controlled on Larkspur Creek. She had arrived in Larkspur Hollow 8 years earlier as the young second wife of a cattleman twice her age, and she had buried him within 3 years and inherited a modest spread that she had, through a combination of sharp instinct and utter ruthlessness, grown into the largest landholding company in the valley. She never raised her voice. She never dirtied her gloves. She simply understood, better than anyone else in the territory, that paper could accomplish what a gun no longer could in a settling land, and that a woman with enough patience could outmaneuver every rancher who underestimated her because he assumed a widow's ambitions stopped at remarriage. It was no secret, in certain rooms, though it was never spoken of in the open, that Lavinia had spent the drought years quietly buying up the notes and debts of the smaller outfits in the valley. $100 here, $300 there, purchased from banks in Cheyenne who were glad to be rid of paper on struggling ranches. She held, among a dozen others, the note old Ezra Sutter had signed against his livery in the hard winter of 1881, when 3 horses had died of colic and the feed bills had come due before the spring drovers brought any money through town. Lavinia had let that note sit quiet for 3 years, gathering interest, waiting the way a patient woman waits, because she understood something the smaller outfits did not yet understand about themselves. A debt held quietly is a debt that can be called at exactly the moment it will do the most damage. She found her moment on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile on a bright, dry morning, with Mrs. Pruitt at her elbow and the door to Sutter's livery standing open across the street. "That Kincaid boy has always had a soft heart for strays," she said, watching Everett's stallion tied outside the barn with an expression of mild, cultivated pity. "It's admirable in its way, charitable, but a man in his position cannot afford to let charity be mistaken for courtship." She paused, letting the words settle the way a good hostess lets a fine wine breathe. "No decent man marries a woman who smells of the stable, Mrs. Pruitt. He'll come to his senses once the season turns. They always do." Mrs. Pruitt murmured something in agreement, because that was easier than disagreeing, and across the street Hattie Sutter finished driving her nail and did not look up, and did not let her face show what the words had cost her, because she had learned a long time ago that the moment you let people see a wound, they consider it an invitation to open it further. The drought worsened through June. The creek that fed half the valley's stock tanks dropped lower every week, and the smaller ranchers began to understand, one by one, exactly whose signature stood at the bottom of the paper that controlled the headgate upstream. Lavinia called a meeting of the valley's landholders at the church hall, ostensibly to discuss water sharing for the dry months ahead, and it was there, in front of 24 ranchers and townsfolk, that she produced Ezra Sutter's note and announced, with the same gentle, regretful cadence she used for everything, that the interest had gone unpaid for 3 years, and the full balance, a sum that had somehow grown, in Lavinia's telling, to nearly triple what Hattie's father had originally borrowed, would be due in 30 days, or the livery and the land beneath it would revert to the Ashby Land and Cattle Company. She said it with the particular sorrow of a woman who claimed no pleasure in the matter at all, and the town, watching, understood exactly what was happening, and understood, just as clearly, that no one in that room held enough power to stop it. Hattie sat very still through the whole of it, her thick hands folded in her lap, her jaw set, saying nothing, because there was nothing yet worth saying. It was only later, walking home in the dark, that her hands finally trembled, not from fear of losing the barn, though that fear was real enough, but from the plain, quiet fact of realizing how long she had been carrying this alone, and how much longer she still had to carry it. Everett found her the next morning, mucking out the far stall with more force than the work required, and he did not ask if she was well, because he could see plainly that she was not, and he had learned that Hattie Sutter did not care for questions that assumed the answer. He simply picked up the second fork and began working beside her in silence, until the stall was clean and her breathing had slowed, and only then did he speak. "I'll pay the note," he said. "Today, if you want it. I'll ride to Cheyenne myself and settle it before Ashby's ink is dry on the paperwork." Hattie set down her fork and looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest ached at the plainness of the offer, at how easily he made it, as though 30 years of a woman's whole labor could be settled the way a man settles a bar tab. "No," she said. "Hattie." "No," she said again, gentler this time, because she understood he meant it kindly, and kindness deserved a gentler refusal than pride alone would have given it. "If you pay it, it's charity, and every soul in this valley who's ever doubted I could hold my own will have their answer handed to them free of charge. I built nothing here. I inherited a debt, and I paid it off with a rich man's money. And that's the whole of my story, forever, whether it's true or not." She picked the fork back up. "I'd rather lose the barn honest than keep it that way. Most women I've courted would have taken the money and thanked me for it," he said, not as a complaint, but as an observation, turning the idea over, the way he turned over every idea before he let it go. "Then it's fortunate for you," Hattie said, "that you never courted a woman who ran her own barn." She kept working, though her voice had gone a shade softer. "I don't fault you for offering, Everett. It was decent of you, and I'll not forget it. But decency and pity can look near identical from where I'm standing, and I've spent too many years teaching this valley the difference to blur the line myself, even for you." Everett Kincaid looked at her the way he had looked at her that first morning, the way a man looks at something he has been searching for without knowing it. And he did not argue with her, because he understood, better than most men would have, that what she was protecting was not the barn at all. She spent the next 3 weeks working harder than she had ever worked in her life. She took on farrier contracts for the Army outpost 40 miles east, riding out before dawn and returning after dark. She hauled feed on contract for 3 of the smaller outfits who could no longer afford Miller's prices, undercutting him fairly and honestly on work she could do twice as well. She called in every favor her father had ever earned in that valley, and there were more of them than she had known, because Ezra Sutter had been a generous man in his time, and generosity, it turned out, left a longer memory than debt did. Word of what Lavinia had done at the church hall spread through the valley faster than the drought itself, and it brought people to Hattie's door she had not expected. Old Tobias Vance, who ran 40 head on the ridge above town, arriving one dawn with 2 lame plow horses and payment in advance, saying only that her father had once shod his whole team on credit through a hard winter, and he'd not forgotten it. The Langley boys, barely grown, showing up unasked on a Saturday to help muck stalls so she could take on the Army contract without falling behind on her regular custom. Even Mrs. Pruitt, who had stood beside Lavinia on the boardwalk that first morning, came by quietly with a basket of bread and would not meet Hattie's eye when she did it, which Hattie understood, in its own small way, as an apology. She did not raise the full sum Lavinia demanded. No one expected she could, not honestly, not in 30 days, but she raised enough to prove, to anyone watching, that she meant to fight rather than fold. It was Everett who found the second thread, not with money but with patience. He rode to Cheyenne himself, not to pay Hattie's note, but to sit for 2 long days in the county recorder's office, comparing the original filing of Ezra Sutter's loan against the figure Lavinia had presented at the church hall, and he found what a careful, unhurried man is uniquely suited to find. The interest rate on the recorded original did not match the interest rate Lavinia had quoted the town, not by a small margin but by a deliberate one, inflated well past what Wyoming territory law allowed on a private note. He brought the recorder's certified copy back to Larkspur Hollow folded inside his coat, and he brought it not to Hattie first, but to the town clerk, a careful, unremarkable man named Whitcomb, who had no reason to love or hate either party, and every reason to care what the law actually said. Lavinia called the second meeting herself, 30 days to the hour after the first, standing at the front of the church hall with Ezra Sutter's note in her gloved hand, and the full valley gathered to watch the small livery woman lose everything. Eugenia Ashby stood beside her aunt that morning, as she had stood beside her at every public gathering since her arrival, pale and correct and silent, until the moment Lavinia turned toward Hattie and began once more, in that same gentle, regretful voice, to speak of debts and deadlines and decent men. The church hall was packed tighter than it had been for the first meeting, every bench filled and men standing 3 deep along the back wall, because word had traveled that something was about to happen worth witnessing. Everett stood near the door with Whitcomb's certified copy folded inside his coat, saying nothing, waiting for the moment when the truth would matter more coming from Hattie's own mouth than from his. Lavinia's voice carried the same practiced sorrow it always had, and for a moment the room seemed ready to let her finish the way it had let her finish every other time, the whole valley trained by years of habit to swallow its objections rather than embarrass a woman of her standing. Hattie stood, her hands did not shake. "You've called me every name this valley allows, a woman without saying it outright," she said, and her voice did not rise, because it did not need to. "You've said I smell of the stable like it's a shame instead of a wage. You've said no decent man would want me, and you said it loud enough that half this town heard it, and I let it stand because I've learned that answering cruelty in its own coin only feeds it. But I will not let you take my father's barn on a lie, and it is a lie, Mrs. Ashby. The note you're holding says one figure to the county recorder in Cheyenne and another to every soul in this hall, and there's a certified copy in Mr. Whitcomb's hand right now that proves it. I have hauled feed and shod horses and buried my own father alone in that barn, and I built every bit of what little I have with these 2 hands, and I will not apologize for the smell of honest work as long as I live. Whatever you think decent men want, Mrs. Ashby, I have never once needed your opinion to know my own worth." The hall was silent long enough that the only sound was the creak of the church hall's old boards settling in the June heat. Whitcomb, standing at the side of the room, cleared his throat and confirmed, in his careful clerk's voice, that the recorded interest rate on file in Cheyenne did not match the figure Mrs. Ashby had presented, and that the discrepancy, under territorial law, rendered the called note void until it was refiled at the legal rate, which, once corrected, Hattie Sutter's 3 weeks of hard-won earnings covered in full. Lavinia Ashby's composure did not crack all at once. It cracked the way ice cracks on a pond in a sudden thaw, a single fine line spreading fast across a surface that had looked solid a moment before. The color drained from her face, and for one unguarded instant the whole room saw, plainly, a woman who had built her power on the assumption that no one small enough would ever think to check her figures. "Aunt Lavinia," Eugenia said quietly, into the silence, and it was the first time anyone in Larkspur Hollow had heard her raise her voice above a murmur. "I never wanted the match. I told you that in Denver, and I'm telling you now, in front of everyone, so you'll finally hear it. I won't be married off to secure land I never asked to own." She turned to Hattie, and something in her thin, careful face eased, as though a weight she had carried since childhood had finally been set down. "I'm sorry for the part I played in staying silent this long, Miss Sutter. You didn't deserve any of it." Lavinia Ashby left the church hall that morning without another word, and the note against Sutter's livery was refiled within the week at the rate the law actually allowed, a sum Hattie's earnings had already covered twice over. Everett Kincaid crossed the church hall floor in front of every rancher and townsperson in the valley, and he did not wait for a quieter moment or a more private room, because he had decided, somewhere in the last 2 months of Friday mornings, that Hattie Sutter had spent enough of her life being talked about instead of spoken to. "I've watched this valley weigh you your whole life against things that never mattered," he said, and his voice, usually so sparing, carried to every corner of the hall. "Your size, your smell of honest work, the fact you never had a husband to speak for you. I've never once needed you to be anything other than exactly what you are, the steadiest hand and the plainest honesty I've found in this territory or any other. I don't want a wife who'll sit quiet while lesser people decide her worth for her. I want you, Hattie Sutter, because you already know your own worth better than any of us ever will. Marry me." Hattie stood in the middle of that crowded hall with her thick, work-scarred hands pressed flat against her apron, and for the first time since her father's funeral, in front of the whole of Larkspur Hollow, her eyes filled, not from shame, and not from grief, but from the plain, overwhelming relief of being seen exactly as she was, and found, at last, more than enough. "Yes," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. "Yes, I'll marry you, Everett Kincaid." They were married 3 weeks later, in the yard behind Sutter's livery, under a sky gone gold with the last of the summer light, with the whole town in attendance, and Miller himself, of all people, standing at the back with his hat in his hand. There was no cathedral, no imported lace, no crowd of strangers from Cheyenne society. There was a preacher, a fiddle, a long table of food the neighbors had brought, and a bride who stood at the altar in a plain blue dress, with flour still faintly ground into the seams of her good apron, because she had spent the morning helping a mare through a hard foaling, and had refused to let anyone else handle it on her wedding day. Everett Kincaid watched her walk toward him across that dusty yard as though she were the only sight in the territory worth looking at, and in a very real sense, to him, she was. Old Tobias Vance gave her away, since she had no father left to do it, walking her the short distance from the barn door to the preacher, with a solemnity that made half the yard misty-eyed. And when the fiddle struck up after the vows were spoken, it was Hattie who led the first dance, laughing, her boots sending up small clouds of dust, her husband's hand steady at her waist, while the whole of Larkspur Hollow watched a woman they had once measured by everything except her worth become, plainly and permanently, the most respected name on that street. 5 years passed, the way years do in a valley that has learned to survive its own droughts, slowly through the hard summers, quickly through everything after. Everett built a house for them on a rise above the Circle K, with a wide porch facing west, but Hattie kept her hand in the livery every single day, because some habits were not meant to be retired, only shared. Miller's livery closed its gilded doors within 2 years, unable to compete with honest prices and honest work, and Miller himself came, eventually, hat in hand, to ask Hattie for a job breaking colts, which she gave him without a word of triumph, because triumph had never been the point. 5 years later, the sign over the barn at the low end of Main Street read Kincaid and Sutter Livery and Feed, painted plain and sturdy, because Hattie had insisted her own name stay on it exactly where her father's had once been. The business had grown to fill every stall she'd once run alone, with 2 hired hands and a standing contract with the Army outpost that Everett had never once tried to take credit for, because he understood, by then, that it was hers to be proud of. Larkspur Creek ran healthier than it had in a decade, once the water rights were untangled from Ashby paper and shared fairly among the valley's outfits, and Eugenia Ashby, who had stayed on in town rather than return to Denver, ran the mercantile now with a plain-spoken honesty her aunt had never managed, and counted Hattie among her closest friends. It was in the barn's back office, going over the accounts one autumn afternoon, that Hattie noticed the girl for the 3rd time that month, a thin, stoop-shouldered 15-year-old named Nettie Calloway, an orphan taken in reluctantly by a distant cousin's family who worked her hard and noticed her little, who had taken to lingering by the paddock fence after her chores, watching the horses with a longing she clearly believed no one saw. Hattie remembered, plainly and without needing to search for it, exactly what it felt like to be a girl the world had decided wasn't worth a second look. Hattie remembered, too, the particular way a girl like that learned to make herself small in rooms where she felt unwelcome, shoulders curved inward, eyes down, as though taking up less space might finally earn her the belonging that taking up her rightful space never had. She watched Nettie for the better part of a week before she said anything at all, wanting to be certain the girl's interest in the horses was more than a passing curiosity, and finding, each time she looked, the same quiet, careful attention Hattie herself had once given her father's forge as a girl too young to be trusted near the fire. "You've got a good eye for a horse's temperament," Hattie told her one afternoon, watching the girl calm a nervous gelding with nothing but a low voice and a steady hand. "Better than most grown men who come through here thinking they know horses. I could use someone with that kind of eye, if you're willing to learn the trade properly. Paid work, not charity. I don't hand out charity, I hand out chances to people who've earned the looking." Nettie Calloway's eyes went bright and disbelieving, the way Hattie's own eyes might have looked, once, if anyone had ever offered her the same thing at 15, and Hattie found, watching the girl's shoulders straighten for what looked like the first time in years, that some debts were best repaid not to the person who was owed, but to whoever came along next, needing exactly what you once needed yourself. No one had ever needed to notice Hattie Sutter for her to be worth noticing, but it turned out, in the end, that the noticing had never really been about her at all. It was about what she chose to do, once she had the standing to do it, for every plain, overlooked girl who came after her.